Hey, it's Sam, and I'm making this quick video to talk a little bit more about the approach of Vedic astrology that I use that honors the text Brihat Parashara Horasastra really above all other texts. You know, first couple videos that I made about this, I describe, the nature of Parashara and that it's based on principles, not necessarily bewildering techniques and methods. And once you master the principles, or you understand the principles, you realize that he's teaching you about Sanatana Dharma and Vedic wisdom, and the same wisdom that filters down into yoga and Sankhya philosophy, which is the philosophy of Ayurveda. And all of those things come together because Parashara teaches through principles and frameworks. Now, one of the most important principles is the order in which things are discussed. And this is an important thing in all, what's called exegesis or, sacred literature. The order in which things are described. So, of course, at the beginning of Parashara, he tells you what astrology even is, which I already told you, this part. Then, right after that, he describes the planets, which the planets come next because the planets are the appearance of Lord Vishnu. Lord Vishnu has assumed the auspicious form of the grahas. So the planets themselves are the form of Lord Vishnu. And the form, of course, contains the essence as well. So the planets are the sovereigns, they are the gods. That's why they're described as gods, and they're related to deities, because they're what create everything. And then, so that first chapter is on the planets. Now, what he does in that chapter is he describes all these different qualities of the planets. The sun is the king, the moon is the queen, Mars is the general, and then he gets into the, the different, the qualities of the 5 elements related to the planets, the 3 gunas related to the planets, the different Ayurvedic tastes, bitter, pungent, sour, salty, gets into all different qualities of the planets. And then after he gives all these different qualities of the planets, in the same chapter, the last thing that he says is he talks about the dignity. This is why dignity, and especially exaltation and debilitation and Mulatrikona, are so important, because they're qualities of the planet, and they're given right in that planetary chapter. Now, the reason this is important is because it also clarifies a lot of sloppy Vedic astrology that has come since then, especially as it relates to the planets as house rulers. Now, I'll talk about that in a minute, but first we just want to understand that what he says about exaltation and debilitation, and also Mulatrikona, and then planets in their own sign, and then planets in different dignities, winds up also directly correlating to one of the avashtas, especially what's called the Jagrad Avashta, which classifies the planets as well based on their natural relationship to their ruler. So, for instance, in Jagrad Avashtas, it says the planet that's exalted or in its own sign is awake, which is Jagrad, or awake. If it's in a neutral, then it's said to be dreaming or sleeping, sleepy. And then if it's in an enemy, it's said to be asleep, or its enemy or a debilitated, it's said to be asleep. So again, we have to infer these things and put these things together. Parashara doesn't put them together for us. He gives us this category at the beginning of or at the end of the planets, at the end of the chapter on planets. He gives you the dignity of the planets, and he says that if a planet is exalted, it gives its full effects. He often uses language like it affects with 4 padas, which means 100%. If it's in its own sign, if it's in Mulatrikona, it's 75% strength. If it's in its own sign, which is the other sign that it rules, it's 50%. Then he goes on from there. If it's neutral dignity, then it's 25. And then he goes down from there. And when it's debilitated, its effects are nil or 0. So again, this can be construed in a lot of different ways, and you have to look at other sections of Parashara to interpret this fully. Again, it's very easy to think 100% means it's good. It's giving me everything. He didn't say it's good. He says it gives a full effect, 100%. Again, this is why it's utterly crucial to understand the temporal status of each planet. That's why it's utterly crucial to understand what's called the functional quality of the planet. You might have an exalted Jupiter, but if it's a functional malefic, it's going to give 100% of its effect, but it's going to be malefic. Again, that doesn't mean it's bad. It means it gives its quality that's in a disruptive way, but it's in a disruptive way to wake you up because it's exalted. Again, what I talked about in a previous video, which shows the way we're able to delineate getting something and liking it, getting something and not liking it, not getting something and liking it, and not getting something and not liking it, is in all of this subtlety. You can see, oh, this person has an exalted Jupiter, that's great. Well, if it's a Taurus person, it's going to be a very disruptive planet. It doesn't mean it's bad, though. It's going to disrupt things to wake them up. This might be an example of getting something you want and not liking it, but learning from it. Or maybe not getting the thing that you wanted and learning from it. Again, you see whether you get it or not based on yogas, but the intelligence is shown by the dignity more than anything else. This is the point. The planets are the forces of intelligence. They're the forces of wisdom. They're the gods. They create everything. And we can create things in full light, or we can create things out of darkness. And the dignity of the planet is the first thing you look at to see how much light and wisdom is coming through that thing. That has nothing to do with what it produces. And it doesn't even mean that it's going to produce something that we want. It means that whatever it's going to do, there's going to be intelligence behind it, if it's exalted. Not just exalted, or if it's in its own sign. Okay? So this is very important to understand, especially exalted planets. And again, it doesn't always mean you can't take this, it's not monolithic. You have to look at a lot of other factors, which I'm going to talk about at some point, not in this video, because I could just go on forever. But it doesn't mean also that, let's say a planet is exalted and in its own sign, so it never makes a mistake. Again, this is the temptation of astrologers, and especially astrology students, to polarize things too far. Everything is a mixture of good and bad. Okay? Even the most wonderful planet, the exalted functional benefic, like, let's say, exalted Jupiter for Aries, which couldn't get much better. All right, it's the 9th Lord exalted in the 4th. Even that is going to create problems, quite a lot at times. But they're problems that we learn from. When the planet is awake, that's the Avashta that's associated with the dignity. When it's in that high Avashta, we learn the lesson of it very easily. We don't have to make a lot of painful mistakes. And in fact, even our threshold for making mistakes with that planet is much less. What I mean to say is that when a planet is in very high dignity, we tend to already understand and already have the wisdom of that thing. We tend to embody the wisdom of that energy already. And in fact, we can learn from we can avoid a lot of the mistakes with it, which means a lot of the really dumb mistakes. We can just circumvent all of them. We just automatically have a filter which knows that thing isn't right. That's what intelligence is. And there are certain areas in our life where we just sort of get it, where our threshold is much higher. And that's also important to know. With planets of higher dignity, the threshold is much higher, which means we come at that thing with a very high standard. Planets that are exalted have a very high standard. We already see the stupidity and the mistake with that thing, so where we start our process with that thing is already very high, so it can also make us a little restless. At times it makes it hard to enjoy the worldly quality of that thing, especially with the exalted benefics. Again, this is the stuff that's just not talked about hardly at all, certainly not enough. And it's incredibly important. When you get an exalted Venus or exalted Jupiter, a person, let's say exalted Jupiter because we already started with that, the person will already have a standard where they can see through failed teachings and they'll recognize good teachings when they hear it. But there'll also be a very high standard for teachers. As soon as a teacher starts to mess up a little bit, they'll say, you're also not my teacher. I need the perfect teacher, perfect. It's not always that way, but it can be. And especially if it's a functional malefic, which means if it rules difficult houses, let's say like for Libra, where Jupiter rules the 3rd and the 6th house, it can really bring them into a lot of conflict with teachers, actually. Because they do have a very high standard, and they do see through bad teaching, and so they'll get into conflict with teachers a lot, as an example. So again, don't ever think any of these things are simplistic. They are all very complex. You have to look at everything, and the dignity is just one thing, but it's very important to know that it's a function of the planet. Dignity is a function of the planet. It's in the planetary chapter, and it shows a level of consciousness with that divine force. Now, how it's been misused, I will say, well, actually, what this proves is that dignity is a function of the planet. Now, one of the big mistakes that's crept into Vedic astrology has to do with what's called the dominant bhava. Because in later Vedic astrology texts, particularly I believe Paladipika and I don't know the other ones, but I'm pretty sure in Paladipika, the author says that in order to find the dominant bhava that a planet rules, you use the Mulatrikona. What I mean to say is that the Mulatrikona sign, like for instance for Jupiter, the Mulatrikona sign is Sagittarius. So a person would use whatever house Sagittarius is to be the dominant bhava. So for instance, let's use Leo as an example. For Leo, Jupiter rules the 5th and the 8th houses. Sagittarius is the 5th house, so according to Paladipika, the 5th house would be the dominant bhava for Leo according to that kind of rule, because Sagittarius is the Mulatrikona. But again, this is flawed. And this is and here's the reason why. Because as Parashara shows you, dignity is not a function of signs. It doesn't say Sagittarius, because Sagittarius is Mulatrikona, it's a stronger sign. No signs are stronger than any other sign. Okay? Exaltation is a quality of the planet, not a quality of the sign, and certainly not a quality of the house. Parashara has an entire chapter on the planets as house rulers, which I'm going to talk about in an upcoming video. Parashara has a very powerful, elegant chapter on the planets as house rulers and the dominant bhavas, which means, in fact, I use Leo as an example because it's just the opposite. According to Brihat Parashara and the simple, elegant, and powerful rules of the dominant bhava, the 8th lord is dominant to the 5th. I'm sorry, the 8th house is dominant to the 5th. Because there are 4 categories of houses, and the 8th is the strongest in that category. I'll talk about that in an upcoming video. Again, these are the things that my certification course students learn, and we learn the truth that, for instance, for a Leo person, Jupiter is primarily the 8th lord, and secondarily the 5th lord, which shows how Leos are always ready and looking to change and transform based on their beliefs. And that's a very creative process for them. So the change and transformation precedes the creativity. This is how you interpret that. And this is exactly true. Leo, if you know Leos, they're always ready to change and shake up the apple cart and burn up something that's not inspiring and truthful. Because that's Jupiter. Jupiter's inspiring and truthful. It's primarily the 8th lord, which says we need to destroy that which is not inspiring us. And that process is incredibly creative for them. So this comes first, which means Leo doesn't say, oh, how can I create something? And then that creativity transforms them. No, the transformation in their mind comes first. So this is how you would interpret that in a general sense. But you see this clearly because of where the dignity is talked about. It's a function of the planet. Okay, it means exaltation shows a quality of the planet. It doesn't show a quality of the sign. It's not saying that, and of course it would make no sense because Jupiter's exalted in Cancer. It doesn't even have anything to do with the sign that it rules. So this is one of those things that crept into the medieval texts and the medieval teachings, which kind of sounds good, but it's not really accurate. And again, like I said before, many of these medieval astrologers, and when Vedic astrology got into this unscientific, way, many of them, in fact, they didn't have access to Brihat Parashara Horosastra. They never even saw the text. You see where they write about hearing about Brihat Parashara Horosastra, but they never even saw it. It was lost during that time. So we now see it. And again, there's a lot of crossover in these texts, but Parashara, anytime you see a discrepancy and you go to Parashara, you see exactly how this works. And again, instead of some simple rule that sounds good, well, it sounds good. If the Mulatrikona is the sign where the planet is better, quote, than the other one. So this is implying that Sagittarius is better than Pisces, because that's the Mulatrikona, then that must be the dominant one. Sounds good, so yeah, we'll do that. And do you know how many Vedic astrologers use that tool? Do you know how many use that idea? Like almost all of them. I mean, I go to conferences and hear astrologers get up and say this. And you look in Parashara, it's clearly not true. Now it's more difficult because the rules in Parashara are much more exact. They're more strict. They're more detailed. There are 4 different classifications of houses, and they're dominant ones over the others. But they're incredibly powerful. And by the way, it's the same chapter that gives us all the rules for Raja Yogas and all that other stuff. So it's an incredibly important chapter. And again, the qualities of exaltation and Mulatrikona have nothing to do with Rashis. It's not saying one Rashi, one sign is stronger than another. And it's certainly not meant to imply that one Bhava or house is stronger than another. This is just where things get extrapolated, and things got extrapolated in later Vedic astrology traditions that, again, it sounds good, but it just doesn't make sense when you go back and look at Parashara. And I mean, pretty much any Vedic astrologer that I know who's went back and looked at Parashara, they see, oh, okay, this is how you do it. This is, you know, these are the rules. And by the way, my first book, The Ascendant, 108 Planets of Vedic Astrology, was all about this. Because you can't do Vedic astrology really well until you get your mind around every planet as a house ruler. Again, once you see how much importance Parashara puts on this, and how incredibly elegant the whole practice becomes once you get your mind around this idea, Vedic astrology becomes a totally different thing for you. You approach every chart with incredible depth. So just your entry point into the chart through every ascendant becomes incredibly rich. Every planet has an entirely new perspective. So we'll talk about that in a future video, but wanted to talk about this important quality of exaltation, debilitation, and its importance in Brihat Parashara Horosastra, and its implications as it filters down into the importance of the planets as house rulers, dominant bhavas, and things that, again, once you grasp this principle, Parashara is about principles. If you just look at the thing and then you don't connect it to other principles, you're not going to know how important it is. And this is typically what happens. This principle looks to be disconnected, or, you know, this thing looks to be disconnected from that thing. They're not disconnected. Because you see that what Parashara says about the dignity is reflected in 2 of the Avashtas. First one is the Jagrad Adi Avashta. That's the first one that he mentions anyway. The first Avashta that Parashara mentions is Jagrad Avashta. But it's also in the Debiltated Avashtas. The Debiltated Avashtas are more about how things feel. Jagrad Adi, literally the word means awake, or, you know, it actually means awake, etc. Jagrad is awake. So it's the level of consciousness. And you can infer that because the Avashta that correlates with the dignity is Jagrad Avashta. And so Jagrad means awake, so we can infer that the planet is awake. Because it's giving full effects means it gives full effects to wake us up. Then you look at the nature of the planet as a house ruler and the temporal status of it to see whether or not the thing that it does is going to disrupt us or fulfill us. These are all different questions. Again, and what happens, what confuses astrology students, is all of it gets lumped together. Well, exaltation, that's good. Like, it's going to be good. I'm going to know it. It has nothing to do with that. It has to do with awareness. And then the other one, the Debiltated Avashta, Deepta means like radiant or, you know, like luminescent. Deepta, like a Deepa lamp. So those Avashtas are about how planets feel. One of the main Debiltated Avashtas is combustion. What's called Kopa is one of the Debiltated Avashtas. That's how the planet that's combust feels. It feels angry or stressed or frustrated. So again, these are all different things, and you have to match them up to see. And so each of the dignities are covered in the Debiltated Avashtas as well. So it's about the way the planet feels and the level of consciousness. It's very early, but it shows a quality of the planet. It doesn't show a quality of the sign. It's not in the chapter on signs. He does a whole chapter on signs and he never mentions dignity. It's in the chapter on planets. It's a quality of the planet and how much effect the planet gives. That's what it is. Signs are different things. Houses are certainly different things. So this sloppiness about houses and house lords and dominant bhavas crept in because it's one of those things that sounds good but really doesn't make sense. So anyway, this could get much longer, but very powerful, important principles here. And this is why you go through Parashara and you start looking at the, like I said, there's about 15 or 20 really important things to focus on. And you see how they all work together and how they all show something different. And when you want to get an answer, knowing which little thread this part of the dynamic is showing. And when you focus on those 15 or 20 principles, they apply in every situation, not just the birth chart. They apply to planets as they move through the sky. They apply to Raja Yogas. They apply in every Varga. They apply when you look in to find auspicious times. These are things that never cease to work. They always work. So anyway, I hope you enjoyed this.